Hello, everyone. This is Tim, your host on Down Periscope, Up Periscope. So, I've got another interview for you here, and before we get into it, just a quick disclaimer that I should probably be putting on all these. The views expressed here are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of either the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, the United States Navy, or the United States government. While strong efforts are made to ensure accuracy, all information is subject to change without notice. Therefore, all personal statements, opinions, omissions, and errors are the commentator's own. As always, more information about the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, or OMSI, as well as USS Blueback, can be found at the museum's website at omsi.edu. OMSI is a nonprofit organization that receives support from various sources, including generous donations from people like you. Now, not every tour guide on USS Blueback is a submarine veteran. In fact, a number of the guides came from the surface fleet, having served on destroyers and cruisers. In this post, we have one of those sailors, and a more general, i.e. non-submarine related story from a Vietnam veteran. So, let's hear the story of a tin can sailor off Vietnam. Our featured volunteer tour guide in this post is Dave Pierce. Dave served in the U.S. Navy as a boiler technician, second class, aboard USS Hamner from September of 1971 to December of 1974. Following his time in the Navy, Dave managed a lumberyard for Copeland Lumber before his retirement. He's been volunteering at OMSI since 2006 in various capacities, including being part of Blueback's maintenance crew. With nearly 20 years of experience and counting as an OMSI volunteer, Dave brings a unique experience as a tour guide, having not served on submarines. With his characteristic raspy voice, he's always keeping his tours fun and representing the surface sailors aboard Blueback. So let's hear what he has to say for his story. Hello everyone, welcome back to Down Periscope, Up Periscope. My name is Tim, I'm your host, and today we have another special guest for the podcast, but not a submarine sailor. We are here with one of our volunteer tour guides, Dave Pierce, and I'm just going to ask him a little bit about what his time in the Navy was like, because Dave has an interesting background in that he is a surface sailor, much like a couple of other of us are. So, welcome, Dave.
Hello there, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, Dave, you're a destroyerman, essentially.
Absolutely. Tin can sailor is what they refer to us as.
That's right. And when did you join the Navy, and why did you want to be in the Navy?
Well, I joined the Navy in January of 1971. The reason I went in the Navy is because prior to that, there was a draft lottery for anybody that was 18 or older, and my birth date came up number 3. And they were taking the first 120 numbers into the Army, so I decided I'd rather go in the Navy, and that's how that started.
All right, very interesting. What rating, what job did you want to do when you joined the Navy?
Well, when I first enlisted, I was going to be a nuclear subsailor. So I went through a boot camp and then went back to Great Lakes, Illinois, and to their first school. And at that time, they did a little more, physical, to check your eyes better, check your teeth and all that a lot better. And I found out that I couldn't be on a submarine with my eyes uncorrected the way they were. So I was offered either being a boiler technician or going on an aircraft carrier. And I said, I'll be a boiler technician.
I see. All right. And eventually you found yourself aboard the Hamner, a Gearing-class destroyer.
Yes, the USS Hamner DD-718, built in 1945, and it was almost 30 years old when I got on it. So we already experienced a lot of seamanship.
See, did you enjoy your job as a BT?
Well, at the beginning, not so much. It was until I made rate. It's dirty and it's hot down there in the fire rooms, and so it wasn't ideal for me. But once I started putting on the petty officers badges, then it became a lot more fun. I didn't have to do a lot of the stuff I had to do as a junior enlisted, and I enjoyed it.
Very good. Now, for some listeners out there and even Navy veterans, boiler technicians no longer exist as a rating.
As a correct, they don't have that.
So, what exactly does a boiler technician do?
Well, back in those days, all the ships were driven by steam except for an aircraft carrier and the submarines. And so steam was made by a boiler, and you took water and you heated it up basically and made steam out of it. And the steam was high pressure steam, 600 pounds per square inch when it came right out of the boiler as you got going on that ship. And then they turned it into superheated steam, meaning they reheated the steam to 850 degrees. And so if you ever had a leak on one of the valves and you walked by it, you weren't paying attention, you'd cut yourself with that.
Oh, wow. And obviously you were there to make sure the boiler didn't explode. And
well, that's true. And it took, even on a typical watch, it took 4 people per boiler. There would be a checkman who controlled the flow of the water going into the boiler. There was a messenger. There was a top watch who controlled the air going into the boiler and ran the whole thing. And then there was a burnerman, and he would be firing the burners. There was 4 burners on the saturated side. There was 3 burners on the superheated side.
So eventually, as you were on the Hamner, you got deployed to Vietnam.
Yep.
Now, what were your initial feelings and thoughts about that?
Well, that's a tough one. We knew that we were going to go there, but as a rule, Navy ships weren't seeing much action. They would do a little gunfire support. However, once we got over there, it turned a complete different direction. We would be going in at night and drawing fire from the beach, from the North Vietnamese, and then letting the spotter planes see where the brights were coming. We called them brights. Then they would radio the carrier that was setting off the other side of the horizon to fire in some jets to land. So we did that. We went in every night, came out every night, and we would fire. They would fire back at us. Of all the ships that were over there, there was about 30 that were Gearing-class destroyers. We were the only ones that didn't take a direct hit. We did have one that went through the ensign, but that was that was as close as they came. We had shrapnel all over the place. So,
do you have any idea what was firing at you?
Not really. I don't. Something like 3-inch shells. If you looked at the pictures of the guns, they looked like old Civil War cannons. Is what they were using, but I'm not sure.
And I think you told me one time you were going up and down the coast doing counter battery fire for these reasons.
Yeah, well, we actually shot over 10,000 rounds of counter battery with the whole 9 months we were over there. The first thing that we did was we had to shadow North Korean trawler, and we followed that thing around. We were actually a mile away from it, running side by side with it. Wasn't quite sure what that was all about. We weren't at general quarters or anything. And then one time they called us to general quarters because the thing had fired a shell at us. So we knew that it wasn't just a trawler. And of course, one of our 5-inch 38s took care of it. That was the end of our patrol.
And Vietnam is quite an expansive coastline. So whereabouts were you off the coast?
God, it'd be hard to say. We went into Nha Nang a couple of times, and we went as far north as Hanoi, and that is because we were in Haiphong Harbor, which is Hanoi's port, and rescuing a pilot there one time. And so I really don't know how much of that coast we covered, but the ones that they were shooting back.
And you mentioned one time you were patrolling with a Coast Guard cutter, U.S. Coast Guard cutter Chase.
Yeah.
Now, unlike your ship, those cutters were fairly new at the time, and they were a combined gas and diesel engine. So you mentioned one time that thing was leaving you in the dust for a while.
It absolutely was. You could hear it. It sounded like a jet, taken off, and we could do almost 40 miles an hour. We could do 38 knots. And that thing left us in the dust many times.
And did you mention one time that there was a scare, like some MiGs or something were flying over?
Oh, yeah. The USS Higbee. We were at general quarters. They were probably 3/4 to a mile away from us off to the left, and we were both going the same direction. And we were at general quarters, but that didn't necessarily mean I couldn't go up and have a smoke. And so I was up having a smoke, and I looked up and saw this bright flash come out of the sky, and it was a MiG. And I can't remember if it really dropped bombs or if it fired something at the Higbee, but whatever it was, it blew their after gun mount off. I mean, really, right off. And come to find out later, luckily, there had been a fire in the magazine and they had flooded it. And so there was no explosion, but they did have to replace the gun mount. Well, then after that MiG circled around it, I thought, well, it's going to come and get us, you know. But before it could, I saw this streak of light come through the sky, and it was an anti-aircraft missile. I can't remember what type it was. Came from the USS Chicago from 65 miles away. That's what I heard later. So blew that thing to smithereens.
Yeah, I see. What it sounds like, I'm not too familiar with Vietnam War history, but that's the Battle of Dong Hoi. Wasn't that where Higbee was bombed?
Yeah, I think so. And the names I wasn't really familiar with too. It's hard to say. You know, you're out either in gunfire support or you're drawing fire or you're, you know, on search and rescue or plane guard operations. And so you're all we're in the same territory, but I really couldn't tell you specific names besides Da Nang and Hanoi.
Well, very good. It's interesting. So eventually, how long were you in the Navy for?
I was in the Navy almost 4 years, a month and a half shy of 4 years. Active duty, you're always signed up for 6 years, 2 years inactive.
And so after you got out, then what happened to you?
Well, prior to me getting out, about 3 months before I got out, I met this girl. and I liked this girl. So I wasn't going to get out. I was going to extend my service and make E6. And then that changed everything. So when I got out, I came up to Portland, Oregon from San Francisco and lived here and went to work at a lumber yard 6 months after my unemployment ran out. And then come to find out, the ship itself had transferred from San Francisco to Portland. And so I saw a lot of the guys that I thought I was leaving behind on a regular basis.
So, yeah, you managed a lumber yard for a number of years, and eventually you found yourself at OMSI.
I sure did. Back in 2006, I don't know who I was talking to, said they had a big Star Wars display down here at OMSI, and I should volunteer, and you get to see all this stuff, and it sounded like a good thing. So I did that. I did guest services for 6 months until the exhibit moved on to someplace else. And then after that, I needed something to do, so I decided I'd become part of the submarine maintenance crew. And Bob Walters, who goes to our church, was the one that kind of turned me onto that. And at first, it worked out really good. It was from 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 8 o'clock at night on Mondays. And that wasn't hard for me to do. Problem was that the recession was in the middle of all that, and hours changed and everything. So they went from noon to 4 o'clock, and I couldn't do that. And so I ended up going to the Pepco building where they build the displays and did the same routine, helped them there because they were there from 4 to 8, or I could be there from 4 to 8, I should say. But they went to the noon to 4 routine too. So I took about a 6 year sabbatical from OMSI and then came back after I retired to become a submarine tour guide. And here I am now 10 years later.
And you're shooting for 5,000 hours of volunteers.
5,000 hours or 20 years. Yeah. And 20 years, yeah.
If you can kind of condense it down, what's something that you really enjoy about being a tour guide on Blueback here?
Oh, the people. Meeting the people. You know, 99.9% of them are excellent. They're engaged. They like it. And but the people is really the visitors or our customers. That keeps me going. With the crew that we have here is about the best we've had since I've been here too, though. I'll be honest with you now. in 10 years, we have a peak, and this is it. It's good crew. Glad you're here.
Yes, we do have a really good crew. So, all right. Well, that's all the questions I've got for you, Dave. But thank you very much for taking your time to answer some questions.
Thanks for asking me.
All right, so that was Dave's experience aboard the USS Hamner during the Vietnam War. Now, to provide some more context for what exactly was happening during the Vietnam War around the time that Dave was there, we need to look at the 1972 Easter Offensive, the Battle of Dong Hoi, and the drawdown of U.S. forces. The Nixon administration's policy of Vietnamization, quote-unquote, beginning in 1969, gradually saw the drawdown of U.S. forces in Vietnam and the turning over of combat operations to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN. With the U.S. forces withdrawing in the disastrous ARVN operation Lam Son 719 into Laos in February and March of 1971, the North Vietnamese seized the opportunity. Despite constant U.S. air attacks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and with additional supplies from the Soviet Union and Communist China being funneled into North Vietnam via Haiphong Harbor, the North Vietnamese began moving thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and tons of supplies into position for another offensive by early 1972. The so-called Easter Offensive, which began on 30 March 1972, was the first major North Vietnamese offensive since the Tet Offensive in 1968. Despite the monsoon weather, U.S. Navy surface ships began conducting gunfire missions along the coast, and the two aircraft carriers on Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin, USS Hancock and USS Coral Sea, responded to the North Vietnamese thrust against the provincial capital of Quang Tri with airstrikes. Within a week, they were joined by USS Kitty Hawk and USS Constellation. USS Hancock and USS Constellation were later shifted to Dixie Station in the South China Sea to forestall the enemy advance on the provincial capitals of An Loc and Kon Tum. These were supported by B-52 Arclight strikes flying from Thailand and Guam. The North Vietnamese eventually captured Quang Tri, but their assault on Hue was halted. By mid-April, the carrier USS Midway arrived, followed by USS Saratoga in mid-May. This concentration of 6 aircraft carriers was the largest since World War II and was not equaled until Desert Storm in 1991. Now, the destroyer USS Hamner was deployed to Vietnam multiple times throughout the conflict. Hamner's last deployment to Vietnam was from April to May of 1972 for operations around the Haiphong Do Son Peninsula in the Gulf of Tonkin. During that deployment, the North Vietnamese had just commenced the Easter Offensive. This was the time that David was aboard her, and it was her last deployment before heading to the reserve fleet. Of course, as Dave mentioned, they ranged up and down the coast of North Vietnam from Hanoi and Haiphong Harbor, and south to at least Da Nang, which is just south of the demilitarized zone on the 17th parallel in South Vietnam. On 14 April, the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized the 7th Fleet to strike targets further north. The Charles F. Adams guided missile destroyer USS Joseph Strauss, along with the Gearing-class destroyers USS Higbee and USS Bustle, fired on 2 SAM sites near Vinh. Around this time, 9 destroyers under Task Unit 77.1 were conducting gunfire missions north of the DMZ and were joined on occasion by the 7th Fleet flagship, the guided missile cruisers USS Oklahoma City. Together, they fired 11,679 rounds at various SAM, surface-to-air missile, and AAA anti-aircraft artillery sites, radar installations, coastal artillery positions, bridges, road junctions, and other targets. Regarding the operations in Haiphong Harbor, Commander Mike Cuseo, the executive officer, or XO, of USS Bustle, recalls that his ship, along with the destroyers USS Buchanan, USS Hamner, and USS George K. Mackenzie, rendezvoused with USS Oklahoma City on the night of 15 April 1972, about 40 miles east of Haiphong Harbor. As they approached the harbor, they drove through hundreds of fishing sampans and spotted a long line of mostly Soviet merchant ships leaving the harbor. No doubt these had resupplied munitions to communist forces, but they could not be engaged. Once they were 8 miles from the shore and a few miles from the Do Son Peninsula, they commenced firing at hundreds of pre-designated targets such as AAA and SAM batteries. These batteries were firing at strike aircraft launching from the aircraft carriers Coral Sea, Kitty Hawk, and Constellation on Yankee Station. Along with B-52s and other Air Force aircraft, these planes were hitting targets in the area. Cuseo describes the scene as follows, quote, "The closer we got to Haiphong, the more intense the hostile fire became. An amazing number of water geysers were erupting all around us, plus thousands of black puffs of air bursts all around and above our battle group. It was literally a page out of a World War II sea battle. I was mesmerized. I was broken out of my revelry by the captain yelling, 'XO, get off the wing and get here under shelter. Better yet, get back to secondary con in case the bridge gets hit. We can't both be disabled. At about 2 miles from the coast, the ships executed a quote-unquote 9-turn, which was a 90-degree turn to the left to unmask all the guns. Kuseo recalls seeing a fighter aircraft get hit by a SAM overhead and the pilot eject. The ejection seat splashed into the water near USS Bustle, and the pilot parachuted down aft of them. As Bustle swung out of formation to pick up the pilot, they were ordered to return, and USS Hamner, directly behind them, picked up the pilot instead. Hamner would later receive an attaboy several days later from President Nixon, and the commanding officer was decorated with a Bronze Star with a Combat V for his actions. Chief Hull Maintenance Technician Maurice Maury D. Karst, a crewman aboard Hamner, recalls that the rescued aviator was Commander David Lee Moss, whose A-7 Corsair II was shot down over Haiphong Harbor. With their magazines exhausted, the destroyers returned to Yankee Station to rearm, thus ending the first gunfire mission undertaken that far north in Vietnam. Now, regarding the Battle of Dong Hoi, on April 19, USS Oklahoma City, along with the destroyers USS Sterett, USS Lloyd Thomas, and USS Higbee, were firing on coastal targets around the area of Dong Hoi. Oklahoma City, trailed by Higbee and Thomas, were operating about 5 miles offshore and 2,000 yards apart. Thomas was controlling Sterett's helo, which was overhead providing spotting for the shore bombardment. Sterett was maneuvering at 5 knots and holding position 12 miles from the target area, with her bow pointed toward the shore to keep her missile launcher unmasked to provide cover from air attack. Around 1700, radar detected 3 air contacts inbound. 2 MiG-17s from the 923rd Fighter Regiment of the Vietnamese People's Air Force, each armed with 2 550-pound bombs, made attacks on Oklahoma City and Higbee. The first MiG overshot Oklahoma City but circled around to make another attack with both bombs, which missed, causing only slight damage to her rudder. The second MiG attacked Higbee and scored a direct hit on her after 5-inch gun mount. Luckily, the gun had suffered a hang fire with a jammed shell in the barrel, so the gun crew had already evacuated the mount before the attack. The bomb hit destroyed the gun mount and wounded 4 sailors. Witnesses to the attack mentioned that one MiG was shot down by a Terrier missile fired from Sterett, and another was possibly shot down as well. On the other hand, Vietnamese counts note that both jets landed safely, but one overshot the runway and was stopped by the arrestor barrier with minimal damage. From Sterett's point of view, according to an after-action report, at the start of the engagement, they held positive radar contact on 2 aircraft flying at an altitude of 3,000 feet above the hills of the coastline over Dong Hoi. One of the aircraft approached the formation, flying at about 50 feet when Sterett fired a salvo of 2 missiles, scoring a hit with the second. After Higbee was hit, Sterett detected 2 additional hostile aircraft over Dong Hoi and fired another salvo as the ships departed the area. The 2 aircraft turned and fled between the mountains, but there were reports that one of the aircraft was intercepted by one of the missiles outside of visual range, bringing Sterett's count to 2 MiGs successfully shot down that day. As Oklahoma City, Higbee, and Thomas retired, Sterett stayed behind to provide cover, but a confused radar picture developed with various false targets being reported. One surface contact was detected at about 10 miles away, and an air contact was observed separating from the contact which closed Sterett at 500 yards per second. Sterett fired on the air contact with her Terrier missiles, achieving a successful intercept at 7,400 yards. This air contact was evaluated as a probable SSN-2 Styx anti-ship missile launched from the surface contact. Now, a word on this possible Styx anti-ship missile. There's a lot of debate as to whether this was actually an anti-ship missile, but it's difficult to verify with any official source. If it did in fact occur, this would be the first instance of a U.S. ship being attacked with an anti-ship missile. That being said, there's a lot of discrepancies in the various accounts, and other articles, for example the ones on Tony DiGiulian's website, navwebs.com, specifically the ones written by Stuart Slade and another written by Larry Rouse and William Barry, ultimately point to a confused radar environment and the possibility that this was not an anti-ship missile, but rather was actually another MiG-17. The ships moved further offshore, and Sterett detected 2 high-speed surface contacts which turned out to be North Vietnamese P-6 torpedo boats that were shadowing the force on a parallel course. With the sun going down, Sterett engaged and sank the 2 torpedo boats with their 5-inch guns. However, the radar picture was described as very confusing, and Vietnamese accounts do not confirm any torpedo boats sunk on this day either. On the same day that Higbee was bombed, the destroyers Buchanan, George K. Mackenzie, and Hamner shelled bridges near the city of Vinh, about 100 miles north of Dong Hoi. During their shelling, 2 motor boats, believed to be Shanghai-class boats, approached the ships from behind an island. Mackenzie fired at the boats and drove them off. A few minutes later, Buchanan received fire from a 122mm shore battery. One shell burst above the ship, killing one sailor and wounding 6 others. On 21 April, 33 U.S. Navy carrier aircraft conducted airstrikes on the Kay-Gat airfield near Dong Hoi, where the MiGs that struck Higbee took off from. One MiG was reportedly destroyed and another damaged on the ground. As a result of these Vietnamese anti-ship attacks, the U.S. Navy ceased close-in daylight operations off North Vietnam. Only nighttime shelling was conducted from here on. Now, I want to take the time here to address some discrepancies in these accounts, starting off with USS Hamner's position on the 19th of April. Dave mentioned in his interview that he witnessed Higbee being bombed. However, I have found no source that indicates that Hamner was operating with Higbee, Lloyd Thomas, and Oklahoma City off Dong Hoi on that particular day. Samuel Cox's narrative from the Naval History and Heritage Command mentions that Hamner was actually shelling bridges 100 miles north near the city of Vinh that particular day. But on the other hand, the official history for the destroyer USS Buchanan mentions that she, along with Hamner and Mackenzie, actually shelled these bridges 2 days earlier on the 17th of April 1972. So in this case, 2 official Navy histories provided 2 conflicting dates regarding Hamner's position. Dave also mentioned to me that other sailors were on deck smoking with him when he witnessed the missile streak across the sky, so there were others to actually corroborate his story. Of course, he got a number of facts incorrect in his interview. He mentions that the missile was fired from the cruiser USS Chicago, not the Sterett, and from 65 miles away. Well, if you look at the range of a Room 2 Terrier missile, it was only about 17 miles, so there's no way it would have gone 65 miles. Now, I don't mean to imply that Dave is lying or exaggerating, because I do believe he witnessed something, but my policy is always to corroborate oral histories with official or reputable published sources. I'm in no way trying to discredit anybody's experience here, but as I've said before, and I'll say again and again and again, memory does funny things over time. Now, it could be that the official histories from the Naval History and Heritage Command website are incorrect. Maybe Hamner was actually present at the Battle of Dong Hoi, but no history seems to point that out. After all, even official histories are known to be wrong at times, and the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships gives absolutely nothing of USS Hamner's operational history after 1967. It literally stops right there. It doesn't say anything about what she did in the 70s. It's no doubt that Hamner and Higbee probably operated together at some point during the war at this time, and it's no doubt that Dave was aware of the attack on Higbee. However, let's play devil's advocate. It's possible that Dave falsely remembered witnessing an event he heard through hearsay regarding Higbee. It's also possible that he looked up and saw an aircraft that he mistakenly identified as a MiG when it may have been a friendly aircraft for all we know. Remember that these destroyers were providing counter-battery fire on targets ashore, and they were vectoring in carrier aircraft to hit targets all throughout this time. Now recall that Dave mentioned that Hamner got lucky and never took a direct hit out of all the Gearing-class destroyers that were there. So it's possible that maybe they were operating with Higbee at the time, they spotted an aircraft overhead, and he saw Higbee take a hit, not from an aircraft, but maybe it was from a shore battery. And then he witnessed a SAM shoot down that particular aircraft. But anyway, in the end, who really knows, right? Now regarding some other thoughts on discrepancies, it's worth noting that being a boiler technician, Dave's normal watch station was not in an area of the ship that would normally allow you to get a clear view of the big picture. It was in the boiler room. He wasn't on the bridge or this combat information center. Furthermore, his description of the guns firing at them being like Civil War cannons is a bit of a stretch in my opinion. I'm willing to bet that the guns that were firing at them were not like antiques or museum pieces, on the big carriages or something being pulled around by horses or whatever. The North Vietnamese military, from what I've read, was not the Viet Cong guerrillas with the black pajamas and the conical straw hats and all that trudging around the rice paddies in the Mekong Delta in South Vietnam. In contrast, they were well-trained and well-equipped from various communist sources. And while they did not possess all the high-tech whiz-bang gear that the US military had, the North Vietnamese military was still a professional force to be reckoned with. Really, at the end of the day, whatever the case, you will always find discrepancies in these anecdotes, and that's why I call these things sea stories. Who knows to what amount they are true, but as we say, quote-unquote, this was no shit. Now, ending off on another funny little story that Dave told me regarding BT punches and sailor words. Now, if you're a newbie sailor to your new ship, you'll often be sent looking for various items around the ship. For example, Dave mentioned that every so often a new sailor would come down to the boiler room with an empty bucket in hand to ask the boiler technicians for a bucket of steam. Another item could be the BT punch, which is an item about as big as a person's hand, and this would be used for punching holes in things. So upon asking for this BT punch, the new sailor would get slugged hard by the boiler tech. So I asked Dave if any sailors ever asked him for the BT punch, and if he ever gave them one. He replied that he'd been asked many times, but here's the thing, Dave is actually a really nice guy, and he wasn't big into hazing, so he never really dished out any BT punches. However, he also told me that he's only hit another sailor once. He was trying to teach this new seaman how to clean the boiler, and this kid just was not getting it. So, this young seaman does the smart thing and started mouthing off. Well, Dave, who had enough of this kid's attitude and having run out of patience with him, proceeded to smack him upside the head. Here's the thing, remember kids, this was the 70s, and things were not kinder or gentler back then. So, a word of advice. Don't get cute with a petty officer, because they're trained in the FAFO School of Discipline. F around and find out. So, that's a sea story from BT2 Dave Pierce, a tin can sailor, Vietnam veteran, and veteran volunteer at OMSI. His stories remind us that destroyers are the backbone of the U.S. Navy's surface fleet. I always enjoy talking with Dave because he lacks that kind of snobby pretentiousness that you'll sometimes find with like submariners, kind of indicative of someone who's let their status go to their heads too much. But on the other hand, Dave's a very honest and straight shooting kind of guy, and he gives a great tour of the Blueback. Now, I encourage anyone to come down for a tour of USS Blueback if you're in the Portland area. You just might get Dave as your tour guide. Regardless of whether it's your first time taking the tour or you've taken multiple tours on the boat before, we all give different tours and we all have different stories to tell. So, there's another fun sea story from a Vietnam veteran, a tin can sailor off Vietnam. Take care, everyone.